So, talking about the gig economy, there's really four things I want to think about with you this evening. First, I think there's a brief sort of definitional issue. Simply, what is this gig economy? What are these various platforms that have become synonymous with the rise of this new form of work? Then, once we've sort of looked at these various platforms, the vast heterogeneity and the things they have in common, the second thing I want to do is set out some of the public narratives surrounding the gig economy. Because understanding this from a legal perspective actually, I think, first requires us to understand what the broader business model is, what the broader implications are. And at the moment, there are two completely different stories, two completely different narratives about the gig economy out there. To some, this is the future of work. This is sort of the algorithm setting us free from the 9-to-5 job, making us all entrepreneurs in innovative, new, exciting jobs. To others, this is a return to sort of medieval exploitation and feudalism, with the algorithm replacing the ancient feudal lord. And what I'll try to convince you, sort of the first half of the talk, is that actually potentially both of these very contradictory stories can be true. They're both true because of the vast heterogeneity of self-employment, because of the very different nature of people working in the industry. And that then is a challenge we'll look at in the third part of my talk this evening, and that is to think about the legal response. And that's to sort of ask, well, why has this rise of the gig economy presented us with such challenges for regulators, for courts, for lawyers all over the world? And then I'll think about the legal responses that we've seen, and I'll try to sort of suggest that some of them, a bit heretical for the lawyers in the room, I'm going to suggest that some of the legal problems arising from the gig economy are actually pretty easy ones. They're ones that actually we've been able to deal with, and I was very nervous this morning when I was waiting for the Employment Appeal Tribunal in London handing down its decision in the appeal Uber had brought against the original case, that they were going to rip the carpet out under my feet. But fortunately they upheld the original decision, so what I'm going to say to you is still legally correct. But then I think there is also a challenge for us to think about what new sort of employment standards we need to help people, whether that is in the individual dimension or in the collective sphere through the involvement of the social partners. That's the plan for the next 30 or 40 minutes or so, and I think there's then quite a lot of time for any questions, for any discussion we might want to have. Right, so what is this gig economy? What's it all about? Well, it's about the platforms. Most of you will have heard at least some of these names, right? Anybody ever taken an Uber ride? I get very different responses to this from different audiences. Well, Uber and a host of other apps that work in very similar ways, whether it's Lyft in the United States, Didi in China, Ola in India, essentially they're apps that you use to connect with the driver to then deliver you to any destination. And importantly, the entire transaction takes place through your mobile phone. Type in the destination, they have all your financial details. They then match you with the driver, and at the end of the destination, you can simply jump out because all the invoicing, all the billing is done through the software. Same sort of model also exists in lots of different sectors of the industry. And one of the sort of interesting questions to think about is how the gig economy has actually been growing into lots of new areas of business. Food delivery. Deliveroo exists here in Dublin. Yeah. Certainly in Oxford, it's become a real menace because there's so many of them that crossing the street without being run over by somebody with their big box on the back has become quite a challenge. But the same sort of companies, you see things like Foodora in a lot of continental European countries, essentially bridging the gap between the restaurant and delivering the food to your home. There are also apps that specialise not on one particular thing, such as Uber or Lyft with driving, or Deliveroo and Foodora with food delivery, and companies like TaskRabbit or Helpling are good illustrations of that. They're essentially on bits of software that help you find somebody to do your odd jobs around the house, whether it's domestic cleaning, or I'm helping you to put together IKEA furniture, or walking your dog. Again, the idea is essentially always the same. You use this app to connect you with somebody who's willing to do the job. Finally, some of these apps in the gig economy even exist completely online. So Amazon has a bit of software called Mechanical Turk, which they promise to actually sell artificial intelligence. What does artificial intelligence mean? You've actually got a person behind a computer somewhere doing the work. So if you need any small jobs like cleaning a data set, or in some instances even sort of designing a flyer for an event done, you can go to one of these websites, post the work, name the price, and then it'll assign it to somebody out there in the world who will actually be able to complete the job. Now, across different countries, across these different platforms, there's lots of tiny variations as to how the model works. And so one of the things we sometimes sort of grapple with in trying to explain the gig economy is this sheer heterogeneity of different business models. I could spend the whole next hour just telling you about the little details about different platforms. Even the same platform will often operate in different ways in various cities, in various countries. But for our purposes, fortunately, that's not a problem, because they have one commonality, and that's what we're here to talk about this evening. The one commonality across all these different platforms is their recourse to large pools of on-demand workers. What the various gig economy platforms are is that they're very sophisticated, highly trained algorithms that act as digital labor intermediaries. Matchmaking is one part of that, but as we'll see, it goes far beyond that in terms of offering a complete integrated service product. Now, when it comes to our sort of understanding of what the gig economy is, we're actually faced with two completely different narratives. As I've already said, on the one hand, there are those who are telling us that this is amazing, this is innovation, entrepreneurship, the state should stay away from it. Then there are those who tell us that this is a sort of return to medieval feudalism and that therefore we should simply ban the platforms. So let's just spend some time looking into each of those narratives to work out what's going on. So the first narrative is one of this essentially being, in the words of one of the reports I found, the front end of a revolution in work, the pursuit of freedom being the driving force behind the gig economy. And you might sort of laugh at this, but actually there are some elements behind the story which are true. In particular, behind two sort of big narratives that we need to think about, and that's innovation and entrepreneurship. Entrepreneurship, what's not to like about that? The idea here being that through these platforms, more and more of us can leave behind the sort of traditional world of work and find other ways of doing work and of getting paid. And there is a lot of evidence that there is truth in that claim. So one problem labour economists think about very hard is matching inefficiencies in the labour market. This idea that maybe in this city, somebody is looking to get work done, whereas in another city, somebody's actually looking for a job. Very hard to actually bring them together and create an overall beneficial transaction. Well, through the matching algorithms, combined with the GPS in your phones, knowing exactly where you are, being able very quickly to match two people, what we've seen is a real story of labour market activation. We've seen a real story of something governments have been struggling with for a long time, trying to find people who were traditionally excluded from the labour market for all sorts of reasons and bringing them back into work. Another element that's of major attraction, it certainly comes out in every survey you see about the gig economy and its positive benefits, is the flexibility it offers workers. This idea that, you can use the app, you can switch it on when you want, jump in your car, drive around and earn some money. That allows the creation of additional income, particularly around peak periods of the year, and as what is said, through this increased labour market activation, does create more jobs, allow more people to do work. The same is true for innovation. So here the claim goes that by having got rid of a lot of these traditional inefficiencies in the labour market, particularly when it comes to matching consumers and employers, what gig economy platforms can offer us are better products at lower cost. Right? This idea that everybody just sort of have a personal driver at the touch of a button was something that consumers could have not thought of 10, 20 years ago. Taxi is very expensive, in some cities hard to get. Now suddenly everybody's got their own personal driver. Same true for things like food delivery or other of these service sectors the companies are breaking into. And the idea is that through this innovation of the matching, by lowering the prices for consumers, you actually massively increase the volume of consumption for these services and therefore in turn create more jobs for people and have better service levels throughout. Another important element in that story are the rating mechanisms that all of the platforms use. Most of them in both directions, both workers rating consumers and consumers rating workers. Essentially, after every transaction, after every exchange on one of these platforms, you leave your rating, and that then builds up a sort of reputation score. And so the next time you're looking to hire somebody to a particular task or job, you can see on their profile online already beforehand how good, how responsive, etc. they are. So that's the first narrative about the gig economy. It's the future of work, it's driven by innovation, and it allows us all to be entrepreneurs. But that is by no means the only narrative we see. Another narrative, which has been scrutinised increasingly both in the media and also politically, certainly in the United Kingdom, is that instead of the future of work, we're looking at a return to medieval exploitation. And instead of innovation and entrepreneurship, we see something very different indeed. So when it comes to the claim to entrepreneurship, for example, well, the flip side of it is very often tightly controlled insecurity, where you have none of the benefits of a stable job, but all the problems with the algorithm constantly watching over your shoulder. This is the idea of the algorithmic boss, that in your iPhone, you've got the little accelerometer, which the software can use to determine how hard you brake. And if you drive too abruptly, you accelerate too much, you drive too hard, you get terminated, you get sacked, simply by the algorithm without any recourse, without any complaint procedure. The other important thing is that in many ways, while the technology is new, the underlying business model is actually an ancient one. If you look into how dock labour was organised in the 19th century, how domestic production was organised from the 18th century onwards through the so-called putting out or homework system, this idea of having very powerful middlemen, having very powerful intermediaries that then sort of parcel out low-skilled jobs and collect the rents in return. Well, the technology here is new, but in many ways you read sort of Ken Mayhew's descriptions of how dock labour is organised in London in the 19th century, and it reads quite similar, like various exposés about modern-day gig economy workers. And that's the real problem here with these powerful middlemen. That is the flexibility we talked about earlier as a great feature of the gig economy also has a much darker flip side. And the dark flip side of flexibility is insecurity. When I switch on my app, wanting to get some work done, well, realistically, if you try to do lots of work driving around London at a Tuesday at 11 o'clock in the morning, there's not going to be a lot of demand for drivers. So you are, at the end of the day, in that flexibility, still bound to the market concerns, and a market that is essentially made and controlled by these powerful intermediaries. Now, at this point in the talk, normally when somebody tells you about the gig economy, you essentially have to choose. You have to choose which one of those two narratives you're going to subscribe to and which one of those two policy suggestions you're going to be believing in. What I'm going to try and convince you is that actually we don't necessarily have to do that, and that there can be truth in both accounts. And the reason why there can be truth in both accounts is because of the vast heterogeneity of people who fall into this broad legal category of the self-employed. So on the one hand, you've got gentlemen like Dave and Zach. Dave and Zach are my builders. They've been helping us rebuild the house my partner and I bought a year ago. And while notionally they work for us, I can assure you that when it comes to both practical subordination and economic dependence, they tell me what to do, and we are very much dependent on them. They're self-employed, but they're genuine entrepreneurs. They get to choose their jobs, they get to set their pay rates, and if they don't like it, or if we don't give them enough tea, they might just walk out halfway through the day on a Friday afternoon. Now, their position is very, very different from, for example, bicycle couriers, here for a company called City Sprint, who've also been successful in litigating about the gig economy over the course of the past year. They, according to a recent judgment by the Employment Tribunal in London, are the very instantiation of inequality of bargaining power and insecurity. Because even though they too are notionally self-employed, they're constantly at the beck and call of the operator behind the little radio they have to wear round their shoulders. And that then is the legal challenge. Because in the legal world, we still think essentially when it comes to self-employment of it as just one broad category beyond the scope of employment law. So whereas on the one hand, most countries have some sort of core category of the employee, the worker, whatever you might call it, the self-employed full stop tend to fall in this other category of the entrepreneur, of the person who's completely beyond the scope of any protective norms. And this is not just a question for employment lawyers, by the way. The sort of issues, sure, we're focusing on employment today, but the actual underlying employment law issue is just as important in tax law, when it comes to value-added tax, VAT, for example. It's a real question as to whether the platforms or the individual workers should be responsible. It matters in social security for a determination as to who has to pay various employer-based contributions. But it also matters in things like competition law, consumer law, tort law for vicarious liability. So our thinking along this model of the binary divide, and sure, some countries today have more modern versions of this with intermediate categories in between the two. But this thinking that either we have workers or we have entrepreneurs is a crucial issue across the entire legal spectrum. Now here is the crux of why this is such a challenge for the gig economy. The platform-based business model is a clear move away from the traditional bilateral stable relationships between a single employer on the one hand and a single worker on the other. Now, to some, that move away from the stable bilateral relationship can open up all these entrepreneurship opportunities we've heard about. To others, however, it means that even though we've moved away from what looks legally like this bilateral contractual relationship, in fact, technology has maintained just as much, if not even more, control over the day-to-day work. And what we've seen as a result of that in the second category is a shift of risk to the individual. Because the employer, the platform, still gets to have all the benefit of the control without necessarily having to bear the concomitant burdens that come with traditional employment relationships. So, how can the law respond to that challenge? And it's here, I think, that we sort of need to divide between the easy cases and the harder ones. Or, to put it more frankly, some of the old avoidance tricks that are about as old as employment law versus some of the new, genuinely more challenging borderline questions. But let's start with the easy cases. The easy cases is platforms that are essentially trying to take work and disguise it as entrepreneurship. And that's something the law is not particularly bothered about. How do we disguise work? There's three aspects to think about: language, law, and technology. Language. Well, one of the really interesting things about the gig economy is that somehow we no longer talk about work. We talk about gigs, we talk about tasks, we talk about rides. On Amazon, they're even called HITs, human intelligence tasks. But we no longer speak this language of work. And some companies have taken this as the most logical extreme and in fact developed these guidelines for their call center staff on how to interact with workers. Deliveroo's guidelines got leaked to the Financial Times and The Guardian last spring, and it was literally a 2.5-page memo that said, instead of hiring, you say onboarding. Instead of you're sacked because you've been badly performing, you say your supply agreement is terminated because you did not meet our pre-agreed service delivery levels, and so on, right? So in one sense, language here is quite deliberately being used to camouflage the reality of the underlying work relationship. Now, of course, at its most extreme, we lawyers all like playing with language. At its most extreme, the way you do this is through carefully crafted contractual clauses. Clauses that you insert in your employment contract, beg your pardon, in your supplier agreement with the independent contractor, that then deny that employment status. And again, this is a story that is about as old as employment law, right? Judges in most countries have various doctrines about the reality of facts or sham contracting in the United Kingdom, where there's a clear disparity between the contractual terminology and the facts of a particular case. The judge will go with the reality of the fact. By the way, this clause is an example that the Department of Work and Pension Select Committee found in an old Deliveroo contract, which they now have been told quite firmly no longer to use. This is a particularly nice variation on our employment status denial clause. Not only does it deny employment status in 2.1, in 2.2, it then gets the putative worker to warrant that neither they nor anybody acting on their behalf will bring such a claim. And 2.3, should in breach of clause 2.2 you end up bringing such a claim and end up winning, you agree to indemnify your employer against all costs arising from this litigation. Now, of course, the reality to us as lawyers is that these clauses aren't worth the paper they're written on. But I think it's nonetheless important that we think about them because of the sheer deterrence effect they might have. Because the vast majority of people, of course, who work subject to these documents are not people who might be quite as familiar as others with legal terminology, with the idea of a sham contract, with the idea of being able to challenge what looks like a pretty harsh contractual agreement. And again, it's interesting that if you read judgments, again, this morning's judgment in the Employment Appeal Tribunal, judges are very actively aware of what they call armies of lawyers. That's a quote from the Uber case, drafting these agreements. And so in terms of being a legal challenge arising from the gig economy, I'm not too worried about them because they're not something new, they're not something fundamentally different. The one thing that is fundamentally different, though, is the use of technology to hide labour. And here I must make an admission, and that is the title of my book, Humans as a Service. I didn't invent it. Indeed, I'm committing the gravest sin of academia. I'm plagiarising it from none other than Jeff Bezos, the CEO of Amazon. Because when he was speaking at MIT a couple of years ago, he introduced, with this slide, which I've also stolen from his PowerPoint presentation off the MIT website, he introduced the idea that Amazon, having sort of managed the selling of groceries, having managed the selling of computing power, having managed to sell organize the sale of storage through the idea of storage as a service, the next big frontier to Amazon, Jeff Bezos said, was to sell humans as a service. And he puts up this little piece of code actually here that essentially shows you how, in sorting out various jobs on Amazon, they could now write algorithms that would just draft in humans to do the little jobs the algorithm couldn't do. So what that piece of code there essentially does is, if Amazon's search engine can't decide between two pictures of two products, whether they contain a human or not, they upload it onto Mechanical Turk, the website I told earlier. They pay 2 cents, that's the 0.02, and then a human needs to click through a batch of these and determine which ones are which. And then it goes right back into the code and the computer keeps doing its job. And the same is true in many ways, in a less obvious way, whenever you use your iPhone to order food or call a ride. There's an increasing amount of evidence from sociological research that people are starting to conflate who actually delivers the service, whether it's your computer on which you're pressing the button, or whether it's the underlying human, the underlying person. And here, I have one picture to introduce you to, which might be the one thing to take away from this evening. And this is the actual Mechanical Turk. This is a famous 17th century computer introduced at the court of Maria Therese in Vienna that could play chess, played and beat Napoleon Bonaparte in chess. And it was this amazing little machine. You could sort of open it up and look inside, and then the chess computer will pick up the pieces, move them around, and it was very good at that. Now, as always in life, or nearly always in life, if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. And so hidden in a tiny little box, quite literally actually hidden behind the sort of machinery and the automation, there was this little compartment for a little person with a candle sitting underneath it, moving the chess pieces above his head. And I think that's a really nice allegory, apart from the fact that Amazon thought it was funny to use this as the name of their gig work platform. But I think it's a really nice allegory for us to think about work in the digital world. It's really important that even though we interact as consumers with labels increasingly through our computer screens, through our beautiful apps, somebody somewhere is doing the work. And that has to be the starting point of our regulatory efforts. So, what then is the real challenge? If it's not the sort of legal construction, if it's not the personal scope of employment law, what are the sort of problems we should think about? I think it's primarily about rethinking the substantive norms of employment law. It's not so much about all this litigation at the moment, are Uber drivers workers or not? Are Deliveroo cyclists employees or not? I think very often on the facts they are, and even if they're not, that's not a legally difficult problem. We have first instance judges, that's what they get paid to do. The really interesting question, I think, is how we can retool our substantive employment law norms for a world of intermittent work, where people might have lots of different jobs, sometimes might have some bits of genuine self-employment, other bits of normal employment. What sort of standards would they need to really help them? And there are three ideas about new employment standards for the gig economy to tell you about. The first one is what I call a surge price for gig work. And more concretely, what I'm thinking about here is to have a higher minimum wage for non-guaranteed hours work. Of course, irrespective of whether that's delivered through an app or through an old school 0 hours contract. The idea being that the employer obviously benefits economically from the flexibility. And what you could do by saying there's a higher minimum wage for non-guaranteed work is you could try and price some of that flexibility back into the actual wage rate. So if the normal minimum wage might be 10 euros, then you'd say for non-guaranteed hour, the minimum wage rate will be €12.50. The idea being that those who genuinely enjoy the flexibility would then also have the economic rewards. But employers might, on the other hand, be deterred from continuously relying on those sorts of business models. And there's some good illustrations, both of the advantages and also of some of the potential drawbacks of this model in what's called casual loading in certain collective bargaining awards in Australia and in New Zealand. So it's not a completely new idea, one actually where we have some evidence of how it works, also some of the potential drawbacks or sort of design features that you need to get right. A second idea to think about is portable ratings. So at the moment, each platform has its own system of stars or points or thumbs up or down or what have you, which workers use to build up a rating on that platform. And the effect that can have is it can lock them in. Because sometimes to get the good jobs, you actually need to have quite a high rating and need to have built up lots of individual tasks before you can unlock some of the most high value tasks. And what that ends up meaning is that if a worker is in a platform with a platform, she's locked in. She can't really easily move around between different platforms. So if we found some sort of way of mandating movable portable ratings across different platforms, that might allow employees to be somewhat more free, to have a bit more equality of bargaining power with the platforms, because if they don't like one particular setup, they can go to a competitor. Again, I should highlight there's some potential downsides in that. Most importantly, of course, the idea that if you're generally hopping around between lots of different platforms, start looking quite a lot like a genuine entrepreneur, like a genuine independent contractor. Finally, and I suppose this is most apposite here this evening, I think there's a real role for social partners to become involved in this area. Rather than sort of trying to reject technology or trying to sort of worry about the problems with technology, I think the exact opposite should be required of the social partners to really engage with the technology and say, okay, how can we think about organizing workers in this context? And there are lots of different illustrations of how trade unions across the world are already starting to think about the gig economy. At one extreme is IG Metall, a sort of what you think of a kind of sort of staunch German, metalworks trade union. Well, they've actually hired a bunch of Silicon Valley programmers from California who are now working for them in Germany, and they're setting up their own platform, a sort of union certified minimum wage paying platform for various kinds of digital work. You can think about certification schemes, you can think about using the technology to organize. There's all sorts of stories about Uber drivers using WhatsApp or Telegram or various apps of that kind. So technology, just as much it can be useful, the algorithms for the employers, can also be quite important for the workers. So in conclusion, 3 quick take-home points, and I think Tom already tweeted them before I started, yesterday, so there's no surprises there for you. I think it's really, really important, number one, that we don't fall into some sort of world of technological exceptionalism. Sure, the technology is new and it's pretty cool and amazing. The underlying labour market challenges are not. We haven't talked here today about 0-hours contracts, about non-guaranteed work, about all sorts of fragmentation in the labour market. In a sense, the gig economy is simply the next manifestation of that. So we should really not fall somehow into thinking that the gig economy needs its own particular regulatory response or is somehow special and different from broader developments we see in the labour market. The second thing to say very actively, we shouldn't stand against innovation, right? The empirical evidence throughout the centuries is that innovation and even automation actually ends up helping workers because of the complementarity of technology makes work safer, healthier, more interesting, increases productivity. The important thing, though, is that in order to support innovation, we need to have a level regulatory playing field. Well, our starting point is essentially to say that if it's not genuine entrepreneurship, then it's work. And we don't need to reinvent the wheel. We've got employment law, we've got a regulatory mechanism for that. And perhaps the final message with that, and again, we haven't had time this evening to think about tax law, to think about consumer law more broadly, but regulating a lot of these relationships as the starting point of employment law will have much broader benefits for the tax base and also for the consumers of gig economy services at large. Thank you very much indeed.